The warning didn't come from a fleet. That was the first thing that unsettled them. When the expeditionary armada of the Karthic Union breached the outer edge of Sol, they did so with the quiet confidence of a species that had never once been challenged by anything it couldn't overwhelm. Their arrival protocol was precise, efficient, and absolute. Mapping, scanning, evaluating, then claiming. It had worked across 19 systems. It had never failed. So when the transmission appeared, simple, unencrypted, and broadcast from Earth itself, it wasn't fear that spread across the command deck. It was confusion. "You are advised to leave," the message said. "This is not a negotiation. No signatures. No military identifiers. No threat display. Just a calm, measured statement, transmitted on every known frequency simultaneously." Admiral Cale Vorn read it twice, then a third time, as if repetition might reveal the missing piece. It didn't. "Source?" he asked. "Planetary origin," his sensor chief replied. "Global relay." Every major communication node on the surface repeated it within milliseconds. Vorn frowned. That level of coordination required infrastructure far beyond what their initial scans had suggested. Earth had appeared fractured. Dozens of governments. Competing interests. No unified command structure. No planetary defense grid. No visible orbital weapons platforms. Primitive. That had been the assessment. And their fleet? Honest. "There is none," came the answer. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it was the beginning of something far more troubling. Because as the armada advanced, the silence that followed the warning did not behave like fear. There were no emergency broadcasts. No chaotic signal spikes. No mass evacuations. The planet did not scramble. It adjusted. Power signatures shifted across continents, not surging, not panicking, but redistributing. Satellite arrays repositioned with deliberate precision. Entire networks went dark, then reappeared on frequencies that hadn't existed moments before. It was subtle. Too subtle. "Run historical comparison," Vorn ordered. "Behavioral models for pre-contact species under imminent threat." The answer came back quickly. No match. That was the second thing that unsettled them. On the far side of the command deck, Archivist Sen had gone quiet. He wasn't military. He wasn't supposed to be. His role was observation, documentation, classification, the careful placing of new species into the ever-growing archive of the Union's expansion. He had seen dozens of first contacts. He knew the patterns. Panic. Submission. Earth had skipped all three. "Admiral," Sen said slowly, his voice carrying a weight that didn't belong in routine analysis. "There's something in the deep archives." Vorn didn't turn. "Then access it." "I'm trying," Sen replied. "But it's restricted. Pre-Union era. Classified under extinct council authority." That made Vorn pause. Nothing in the archives was inaccessible, not to a fleet of this level. Not to him. Override it. A moment passed. Then another. "It's not responding to Union clearance codes," Sen said. "It's older than that." Now the command deck was silent. Because there were only a few things older than the Union. And none of them were supposed to matter anymore. "What's the classification tag?" Honest. Sen hesitated, as if saying it aloud might give it weight it didn't deserve. "Containment designation," he said. Vorn turned. "For what species?" Sen looked up from his console, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes. "For humanity." The armada continued its advance toward Earth. No defenses fired. No surrender came. Only that single message, still echoing across every channel, unchanged. "You are advised to leave." And for the first time in his career, Admiral Cale Vorn found himself wondering, not what would happen if they attacked, but what had happened before they arrived. The deeper they looked, the less sense it made. Earth did not hide its cities. From orbit, they were clearly visible, vast clusters of light stretching across continents, interconnected by networks that pulsed with activity. The planet was alive in a way most pre-unified species were not. Not chaotic. Not stagnant. Something in between. Controlled disorder. And yet, there was no singular authority. No central command signature. No unified military doctrine detectable through conventional scans. They're divided, one of the tactical analysts said, almost reassuring himself as he spoke. Multiple governing bodies. Independent economies. Competing ideologies. They shouldn't be able to coordinate at this level. But they were. Every time the fleet shifted position, something on the surface responded, not visibly, not aggressively, but precisely. A network here would reroute. A power grid there would redistribute load. Satellite constellations adjusted their orbits by fractions of degrees, aligning into patterns that had no obvious defensive purpose. It was like watching a machine pretend to be disorganized. Admiral Vorn stood at the forward display, arms folded behind his back, studying the planet as if it might betray its secret through sheer observation. Any signs of military mobilization? He asked. None that match standard models, the sensor chief replied. No large-scale troop movement. No visible fleet construction. No escalation signals. Then what are they doing? No one answered. Because no one knew. Across the deck, Archivist Sen had finally breached a fragment of the restricted file. It wasn't much, just a corrupted index, a few lines of metadata, but it was enough to raise more questions than it answered. Admiral, he said, voice tighter now, the containment designation isn't external. Vorn didn't look away from the display. Clarify. It's voluntary, Sen said. The classification notes suggest the species initiated it themselves. That was impossible. No species isolated itself voluntarily. Expansion was instinct. Survival demanded growth, adaptation, resource acquisition. To remain confined to a single system, especially one as resource-rich as Sol, was not strategy. It was restraint. Reason. Honest. The data is missing, Sen replied. Redacted beyond recovery. But there's a recurring annotation, something referenced multiple times across what remains of the archive. Vorn turned slightly. What annotation? Sen hesitated again. Do not escalate. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. On the surface of Earth, a response finally came, but not the one the Karthic Union expected. It wasn't a surrender. It wasn't even a negotiation. A single vessel rose from the planet's atmosphere. It wasn't large. By Union standards, it barely qualified as a ship at all. No heavy armament signatures. No shield arrays capable of withstanding orbital bombardment. It ascended slowly, almost deliberately, until it reached a stable position just beyond the planet's gravitational boundary. Then it stopped. Is that their envoy? One officer asked. No escort, another noted. No defensive screen. They're not even masking their emissions. They're not trying to survive an engagement, Vorn said quietly. The small vessel transmitted a signal. Direct. Unencrypted. I am Dr. Lena Ortiz, the voice said, calm and unmistakably human. You've crossed a boundary that was not meant to be crossed. There was no tremor. No fear. Just certainty. This is your second warning, she continued. You are operating under incorrect assumptions. I strongly advise you to correct them. Vorn stepped forward, activating the return channel. You are in no position to issue warnings, he said evenly. Your species lacks the capability to enforce them. The pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. When she spoke again, there was something different in her tone. Not anger, not defiance. Recognition. Yes, Ortiz said. That's what they all thought. The channel went silent. On the command deck, no one moved. Because buried in that simple statement was something far more dangerous than a threat. It implied history. And the problem with history, especially the parts that get buried, is that it doesn't disappear. It waits. Vorn turned back to the display, his gaze narrowing as new data began to populate across the sensor arrays. Energy signatures. Hundreds of them. No, thousands. Not rising. Not attacking. Activating. All at once. What? Vorn said slowly. Did we just walk into? The activation spread like a thought finishing itself. At first, it was only a pattern, isolated energy spikes scattered across the planet's surface, faint and indistinct against the constant noise of a living world. Then the pattern repeated. And then it multiplied. Within seconds, thousands of signals aligned. They weren't random. They weren't independent. They were synchronized. Mapping, the sensor chief said, his voice tightening as he pulled the data into a unified display. All points are activating within a tolerance window of less than half a second. That's not possible, another officer muttered. Not without a centralized command system. Vorn didn't respond. Because there was no command signal. No broadcast. No detectable trigger. Whatever had just been set in motion had not required communication. It had required agreement. Overlay with known infrastructure, Vorn ordered. The display shifted, layering the activation points over the planetary map. Cities. Remote regions. Oceans. Mountain ranges. Places where nothing significant should exist. And yet something did. Hidden facilities? Sen asked. Not hidden, the sensor chief replied slowly. Integrated. That was worse. Because it meant these systems hadn't been built recently. They hadn't been rushed into existence in response to the fleet's arrival. They had been there, woven into the planet's structure, concealed in plain sight. Waiting. For what? Vorn asked. No one answered. But the data kept coming. The energy signatures began to stabilize, shifting from activation spikes into sustained output. The scale became clearer. Massive. Not weapon class. Not defense grid class. Something else entirely. Cross-reference with known technologies, Vorn said. The system processed. Then returned nothing. No match. No classification. Just a blank where understanding should have been. On the far side of the deck, Sen had gone deeper into the fragmented archive. What little he could access was chaotic. Disconnected records, corrupted timelines, references without context. But a pattern was beginning to form. Not in what was there, but in what wasn't. Entire sections of history had been removed. Not destroyed. Erased. Admiral, Sen said quietly, this species, they've had contact before. Vorn's gaze sharpened. With whom? I don't know, Sen admitted. There are references to external engagements, but no identifying data. It's like someone cut the names out of the records. Why would they do that? Sen hesitated. Maybe because naming them would explain too much. That was not an answer Vorn liked. Timeline, he pressed. Sen brought up what fragments he had. Estimated multiple incidents, he said. Spread across several centuries. Each one ends the same way. How? The pause. Silence. Not defeat. Not conquest. Silence. Vorn turned back to the planet, watching the activation points settle into something disturbingly stable. Define silence, he said. Sen swallowed. No further contact, he said. From the other side. The implication settled across the command deck like a slow-moving shadow. Not that humanity had been defeated, but that whatever they had faced had stopped responding. Below, Earth continued its transformation. The energy signatures began linking, subtle connections forming between distant points, creating a network that stretched across the entire planet. It wasn't visible in any physical sense, but the data painted a picture of something vast and interconnected. Not a weapon. Not a shield. A system. Purpose. Vorn asked. Unknown, the sensor chief replied. But it's not localized. Whatever this is, it operates at a planetary scale. And they've been sitting on it this entire time, another officer said quietly. Vorn considered that. A species with no interstellar presence. No expansion beyond its own system. And yet, possessing a planetary system of unknown function, hidden in plain sight, activated only under specific conditions. Conditions that had just been met. The channel flickered again. Dr. Lena Ortiz reappeared, her expression unchanged, her posture as composed as before. You're still here, she said. It wasn't a question. Vorn stepped forward. You claim we are operating under incorrect assumptions, he said. Clarify. A brief pause. No, she said simply. You need to see it. See what? But the answer didn't come through words. It came through data. A transmission packet, massive and dense, pushed through the channel directly into the Union systems. It wasn't an attack. It carried no malicious code. It was information. Do we isolate it? The sensor chief asked. Vorn shook his head. Process it. The system began to decode. At first, it looked like historical data. Primitive records. Images. Conflicts. Fragmented timelines. Human wars. Thousands of them. Layered over centuries. Then the scale expanded. Simulations. Not theoretical. Tested. Repeated. Variations of conflict scenarios, planetary invasion, resource collapse, biological extinction events, artificial intelligence uprisings, external threats of unknown origin. Every scenario ended differently. Except for one pattern. Humanity never stopped. They've been running war models, one of the analysts whispered. For how long? Another asked. No one answered. Because the data kept going. And then came the part that made the room go quiet. These weren't just simulations. They were improvements. Each iteration refined. Each failure studied. Each loss incorporated. They're not preparing for us, Sin said slowly. Vorn's eyes narrowed. Then what are they preparing for? Sin didn't look away from the screen. His voice dropped, almost to a whisper. Everything. Below them, the network completed its formation. Across the entire planet, the system locked into place. And for the first time since their arrival, the fleet's sensors registered something new. Not a weapon charging. Not a defense activating. Something far more unsettling. The absence of uncertainty. As if, somewhere on that planet, a decision had just been finalized. The first strike was meant to restore order. It was not an act of desperation, nor cruelty, nor even aggression in the way lesser species understood it. To the Karthic Union, it was procedure, a controlled demonstration of consequence. A calculated display designed to collapse resistance before it could take shape. Admiral Kale Vorn authorized it without hesitation. A single orbital lance, focused and precise, targeted a remote installation far from any major population center. The objective was simple: show capability, avoid unnecessary escalation, compel submission. The beam descended in silence. From orbit, it looked clean, efficient, a flawless execution of superiority. On the surface, the impact erased the facility in less than 3 seconds. Direct hit confirmed, the tactical officer reported. Target neutralized. Vorn watched the aftermath unfold across the sensor grid, waiting for the response he had seen dozens of times before. Panic. Disruption. Surrender. Instead, nothing. No surge in communications. No emergency broadcasts. No scrambling of civilian systems. The planetary network did not spike or fracture. It absorbed the loss. As if it had expected it. Rescan the surrounding region, Vorn said. The data returned quickly. No secondary damage, the sensor chief said. Energy dispersion contained. Structural collapse localized. That's not possible, another officer said. The output should have caused atmospheric disturbance, thermal shock. It didn't, the chief replied. Something redirected the excess. Vorn's attention sharpened. Redirected where? The pause. Nowhere we can track. The strike had not simply destroyed its target. It had been managed. Below, the planetary network shifted again, not in response, but in continuation. The activation pattern adjusted, compensating for the loss of the facility without any visible disruption to the larger system. As if the system had accounted for the strike before it happened. On the command deck, a quiet tension began to spread. This isn't defensive behavior, one of the analysts said. They're not reacting to us. Then what are they doing? Another asked. No one had an answer. The channel opened again. Dr. Lena Ortiz appeared as before, her expression unchanged, her presence steady against the backdrop of growing uncertainty. You've made your decision, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Vorn stepped forward, his tone controlled. You were given the opportunity to comply, he said. You chose otherwise. Ortiz tilted her head slightly, as if considering the phrasing. No, she said. We chose earlier. A subtle shift passed through the deck. Earlier than what? Vorn asked. Earlier than you arriving, she replied. The implication settled in slowly, like something too large to grasp all at once. You're suggesting this outcome was predetermined, Vorn said. Ortiz held his gaze. I'm saying, she said, you were never the variable. Silence followed. Because if that was true, then this was not a conflict. It was a sequence. Behind Vorn, the sensor arrays lit up again. More signals. Not from the surface this time. From orbit. Admiral, the sensor chief said sharply. New objects, multiple vectors, originating from within the atmosphere. Vorn turned. The display filled with trajectories, hundreds of them, rising from the planet in perfect synchronization. Not ships. Not missiles. Too small. Too numerous. What are they? Vorn demanded. The system struggled to classify. Unknown, the chief said. No recognizable propulsion signatures. No weapon locks. They're repositioning. The objects spread outward, forming a lattice around the planet. Not aggressive. Not intercepting. Encircling. Are they targeting us? One officer asked. No, the chief said slowly. They're ignoring us. That was worse. Because it meant they had another purpose. The lattice expanded, connecting with the planetary network below, creating a structure that extended beyond the surface, beyond the atmosphere, into space itself. A system that wasn't just planetary anymore. It was becoming something else. Energy output increasing, the chief added. Exponentially. Vorn's instincts, honed over decades of command, began to register something he had not felt in years. Not fear. Recognition. The shape of a situation that no longer followed expected rules. This is escalation, the tactical officer said. We should respond, deploy full strike capacity before. Before what? Vorn cut in. No answer came. Because no one knew what they were about to face. On the channel, Ortiz remained. You can still leave, she said. There was no urgency in her voice. No threat. Just a statement. Vorn studied her, searching for any sign of deception, any indication that this was a bluff. He found none. You've constructed something, he said. Explain its purpose. Ortiz's gaze didn't waver. It's not for you, she said. That answer landed harder than any threat. Because it meant whatever was being built was meant for something else entirely. Behind Vorn, the lattice completed another phase of its expansion, locking into a configuration that triggered a cascade of new readings across the fleet sensors. Gravitational fluctuations. Localized distortions. Space itself adjusting. Admiral, the sensor chief said, his voice no longer steady. We're detecting. He stopped. Because the data didn't make sense. Or maybe it made too much. What is it? Vorn demanded. The chief swallowed. It looks like, he began, then corrected himself. No, it is. A long pause. A boundary. The word hung in the air. Because boundaries were not built in the middle of space. They were drawn. And enforced. Vorn turned back to the display, watching as the invisible structure expanded outward from Earth, growing beyond the immediate orbit, extending into the surrounding system. Not trapping them. Not attacking them. Defining something. Dr. Ortiz, Vorn said, his voice quieter now, more deliberate. What exactly have you activated? For the first time, she didn't answer immediately. And in that silence, something shifted. Not on the planet. Not in the fleet. But in the understanding of what this moment represented. When she finally spoke, her voice carried something new. Not warning. Not defiance. We turned it back on, she said. Vorn felt the implication before he understood it. Turned what back on? Ortiz looked past him, as if seeing something far beyond the fleet. Something older. Something waiting. The reason we stayed here, she said. The lattice expanded again. The boundary pushed outward. And somewhere, deep within the fabric of space, something noticed. The moment the boundary expanded beyond the orbit of the outer planets, the fleet's systems began to fail, not catastrophically, not violently, but subtly, like instruments suddenly unsure of their own purpose. Navigation grids flickered. Long-range scans blurred. Even time synchronization protocols slipped out of alignment by fractions that should have been impossible. "Stabilize the array," Vorn ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut through the rising tension. "We're trying," the sensor chief replied, fingers moving rapidly across his console. "But the distortion isn't external interference. It's baseline. Space itself is recalibrating." That word again. Recalibrating. As if something had just reset the rules. Across the display, the expanding lattice no longer looked like a structure. It looked like a framework, an invisible architecture pressing itself into existence, aligning reality to a pattern that had been waiting beneath it. "Admiral," Sin said, his voice quieter now, stripped of earlier uncertainty. "The archive fragment, it's updating." Vorn turned sharply. "That's not possible." "It is now," Sin replied. The previously corrupted file was no longer fragmented. Lines of data were rewriting themselves in real time, as if the system had been locked behind a condition that had just been fulfilled. Sen's hands hovered over the interface, hesitant for the first time. "Read it," Vorn said. Sen swallowed, then began. "Containment Protocol, Earth System." His voice tightened. "Initiated by mutual agreement between subject species and external coalition. Purpose: prevent uncontrolled escalation beyond local domain." The pause. The words seemed heavier now. "Continue," Vorn said. Sin did. Subject species designated as high adaptability conflict entity. Capable of exponential escalation under existential threat conditions. Prior engagements resulted in systemic destabilization beyond acceptable thresholds. The command deck went still. Not a single officer spoke. Because this wasn't a warning. It was a record. "They've done this before," someone whispered. Vorn didn't look away from Sun. "How many engagements?" he asked. Sin scanned further down, his expression shifting. "It doesn't say," he said. "The number is removed." "Removed?" "Not redacted," Sin clarified. "Deleted. As if the value itself was considered dangerous information." That was not how records were kept. That was how they were buried. "Next section," Vorn said. Sen hesitated, then continued. "Resolution: subject species agreed to self-containment following demonstration event. External coalition established boundary conditions. Subject retained autonomy under condition of non-expansion and suppression of escalation protocols." Vorn's jaw tightened. "Demonstration event," he repeated. "Define it." "I can't," Sin said. "There's no detail. Just a note." "What note?" Sen's voice dropped. "Outcome confirmed. No further attempts recommended." Silence fell across the deck again. But this time, it wasn't confusion. It was realization. They had not discovered a primitive species. They had breached a containment zone. Below them, Earth continued its transformation. The planetary network had extended far beyond the atmosphere now, the lattice integrating into the surrounding space with increasing stability. The distortions that had unsettled their systems began to settle into something consistent. Not chaotic. Structured. "Admiral," the sensor chief said, more quietly now, "we're picking up additional signals." Vorn didn't need to ask from where. "Origin." "Not local," the chief said. "Deep space. Multiple vectors. Long range." A chill moved through the command deck. "How long have they been transmitting?" Vorn asked. The chief hesitated. "They haven't," he said. Vorn turned slowly. "Then what are we detecting?" The chief looked up, his expression no longer composed. "Their responses." The implication hit harder than any weapon. The boundary wasn't just containment. It was a signal. And now, something had answered. On the channel, Dr. Lena Ortiz reappeared. This time, there was no calm detachment. There was something else beneath it. Something heavier. "You weren't supposed to trigger it," she said. Vorn stepped forward. "You built this," he said. "You maintained it. You expected this outcome." Ortiz didn't deny it. "We prepared for the possibility," she said. "That's not the same thing," Vorn replied. "No," she agreed. "It's worse." Behind him, The sensor arrays continued to populate with incoming data, signals from beyond their mapped space, moving toward the system at speeds that didn't align with any known propulsion method. How many? Vaughn asked. The chief didn't answer immediately. We don't know, he said. They're not resolving as individual objects. Then what are they? The chief's voice dropped. They look like events. Vaughn felt the shift again. Not fear. Recognition. The shape of a situation spiraling beyond control. He turned back to Ortiz. You're not just containing yourselves, he said. It wasn't a question. She held his gaze. No, she said quietly. Then what are you containing? For the first time, her composure cracked. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But in the smallest shift of her eyes. The kind that revealed truth before words did. Things that learned about us, she said. The command deck fell into absolute silence. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The erased records. The missing numbers. The silence after past encounters. Humanity hadn't been avoiding the galaxy. The galaxy had been avoiding what followed them. Behind the fleet, space rippled. Not from the boundary. From beyond it. And whatever was coming was not slowing down. The first one arrived without crossing the boundary. That was the detail that broke the last remaining assumptions. It didn't decelerate. It didn't emerge from transit. It simply appeared at the edge of the system, where the expanding lattice met the dark between stars. One moment there was empty space, the next there was a distortion, subtle at first, like heat-bending light, then deeper, more structured, until even the fleet's sensors stopped trying to interpret it as an object. Because it wasn't one. Contact at boundary perimeter, the sensor chief said, voice tight but controlled. No propulsion signature. No mass reading we can quantify. Size. Phonest. The chief hesitated. Undefined. The distortion shifted, folding slightly inward against the boundary as if testing it, not with force, but with awareness. The lattice responded instantly, reinforcing along that vector, energy redistributing across the entire network in a seamless, silent adjustment. They're interacting, one of the analysts whispered. Is it an attack? Another asked. No, the chief said. He stopped, searching for a word that fit. Observation. That word echoed uncomfortably, because it implied intent. And intent implied intelligence. The distortion pressed closer, not breaching the boundary, but aligning with it, matching its geometry in a way that suggested familiarity. Like something recognizing a door it had seen before. More contacts, another voice called out. The display filled with them. Not hundreds. Not thousands. Indeterminate. Each one manifesting along different points of the boundary, each one different in shape, in behavior, in the way space bent around it, but all sharing the same impossible characteristic. They weren't arriving. They were appearing. Admiral, Sin said, his voice no longer analytical but strained. The archive. There's another section opening. Vaughn didn't look away from the display. Read it. Sin didn't hesitate this time. Post-containment observations. External entities demonstrate persistent interest in subject species. Engagement patterns indicate adaptive curiosity rather than territorial expansion. Subject classification updated, not prey, not competitor, catalyst. A ripple of unease passed through the command deck. Catalyst for what? Someone asked. Sin continued. Entities exhibit increased activity when subject enters escalation phase. Hypothesis. Subject behavior triggers interaction cycles. Vaughn's eyes narrowed. They're drawn to conflict, he said. No, Sin replied, his voice lower now. They're drawn to us. That distinction mattered. Below, Earth's network surged again, the lattice brightening, not visibly, but in the way the data spiked across every sensor array. The boundary reinforced itself further, layers of energy folding into each other, stabilizing against the growing pressure. They've done this before, Vaughn said, more to himself than anyone else. Yes, Sin replied. And they survived it. For how long? That question hung unspoken. Because the archive had not said. On the channel, Dr. Lena Ortiz appeared again, But this time the calm precision in her voice was under strain. "You need to leave," she said. There was no preamble. No measured warning. Just urgency. Vorn stepped forward, his tone sharpening. "You knew this would happen," he said. "You knew what was out there." "We knew enough," Ortiz replied. "Not everything." "That's not good enough," Vorn said. "No," she agreed. "It never is." Behind him, one of the distortions along the boundary shifted, this time not just pressing, but probing. A filament of warped space extended toward the lattice, brushing against it. The response was immediate. The entire network reacted, energy cascading across the system, reinforcing the contact point with overwhelming precision. The filament withdrew. Not repelled. Not damaged. Just finished. As if it had learned what it needed. "They're testing us," the tactical officer said. "No," Vorn said quietly. "They're learning us." That was worse. Because learning implied progression. And progression implied change. "How long until the boundary fails?" Vorn asked. The sensor chief didn't answer immediately. "It's not failing," he said. "It's holding." "For how long?" The chief looked at the data, then shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "This system wasn't built to stop them." Vorn turned slowly. "Then what was it built to do?" No one answered. Because the answer was becoming clear. It wasn't a wall. It was a signal. A delay. A way to buy time. For what? The question didn't need to be asked. It was already happening. Below them, Earth's activity had shifted again. The network was no longer just maintaining the boundary. It was changing. New patterns emerging across the lattice, new configurations forming, as if the system itself was adapting in real time. "They're modifying it," the chief said. "Based on what?" Vorn asked. The chief looked at the boundary, at the distortions pressing against it, at the data streaming in faster than their systems could fully process. "Based on them," he said. That was the moment it became undeniable. Humanity wasn't just holding the line. They were learning the enemy. In real time. Across an entire planet. Across an entire system. And every second that passed, they were getting better. Another distortion surged forward, larger this time, pressing harder against the boundary. The lattice flared in response, energy output spiking across the network. For a brief moment, the boundary wavered. Just a fraction. But it was enough. Something slipped through. Not fully. Not completely. But enough to be seen. The command deck froze as the sensors struggled to interpret what had crossed that threshold. There was no shape. No structure. Just presence. And in that presence, something looked back. Not at the fleet. Not at the boundary. At Earth. At humanity. As if recognizing something it had been searching for. "Admiral," the sensor chief whispered. Vorn didn't respond. Because for the first time since entering the system, he understood exactly how small they were in this equation. And how dangerous humanity might actually be. On the channel, Ortiz spoke again, her voice steadier now, but heavier. "This is why we stayed," she said. Vorn's eyes remained fixed on the anomaly. "Stayed where?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. "Contained," she said. The word landed differently now. Not as a limitation, but as a choice. Behind the fleet, more distortions gathered. The boundary held. For now. But the pressure was building. And whatever had just looked through wasn't leaving. The moment it looked back, everything changed. Not in the violent, explosive way the Karthik Union had been trained to recognize as escalation, but in something far worse, something quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Across the fleet, systems began to respond to inputs that had not been issued. Targeting arrays shifted focus. Navigation routes recalculated. Defensive protocols activated against vectors that did not exist. "Override," the tactical officer snapped, hands moving rapidly across his console. "We're getting false positives across." "It's not false," the sensor chief cut in, his voice strained. "Something is interacting with the systems at a conceptual level. It's not sending commands, it's influencing interpretation." That wasn't possible. Technology didn't behave that way. But the data didn't lie. The fleet wasn't being attacked. It was being understood. Vorn stood at the center of it, unmoving, his gaze fixed on the boundary where the presence still lingered, half seen, half felt, pressing against the edge of reality like something testing the limits of a cage it already knew how to open. "They're not engaging us," he said quietly. "No," Sin replied. "We're not relevant." That realization hit harder than any loss of control. Because it meant they were never the target. Behind the fleet, more distortions gathered, their number no longer even approximated by the sensors. The boundary shimmered under the pressure, not breaking, not collapsing, but straining. And below it, Earth responded. Not with panic, not with desperation, but with acceleration. "They're increasing output," the sensor chief said. "Across the entire network. Energy levels are rising beyond previous thresholds." "For reinforcement?" the tactical officer asked. The chief shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "For expansion." The word hung in the air. Because expansion meant this wasn't the limit. On the surface, the planetary network shifted again, its patterns no longer just reactive or adaptive, but predictive. Entire sections of the lattice reconfigured before the distortions even moved, anticipating contact points, reinforcing weak vectors, redirecting energy with a precision that bordered on inevitability. "They're modeling them," Sin said, his voice almost disbelieving. "In real time. At scale." Vorn didn't look away from the display. "How long until they surpass our understanding of these entities?" he asked. Sin didn't answer immediately. "They already have," he said. Silence followed. Because that meant humanity was no longer defending. They were advancing. The channel opened again. Dr. Lena Ortiz appeared, and this time there was no calm left to hide behind. Her composure remained, but beneath it was something raw, something that spoke of pressure mounting faster than even she had expected. "You need to withdraw," she said. There was no room for interpretation now. No diplomacy. No patience. Vorn stepped forward, his voice steady but heavier than before. "If we leave," he said, "does this stop?" Ortiz held his gaze. "No," she said. The answer came without hesitation. "Then what changes?" he pressed. The pause. Not uncertainty. Calculation. "Where it happens," she said. That was the moment the truth fully settled. This wasn't a war they had started. It was a process they had triggered. And now, it had direction. Behind Vorn, alarms began to cascade, not from external attack, but from internal collapse of predictive models. Every system designed to anticipate outcomes was failing simultaneously, unable to account for the variables now in play. "We can't simulate this," the sensor chief said, his voice no longer controlled. "There's no baseline. No pattern stability. The system keeps rewriting itself faster than we can process." "That's because it's not static," Sin said quietly. "It's evolving. Not just the entities beyond the boundary. Humanity. Together. A feedback loop of adaptation, each side learning from the other, escalating not through force, but through understanding. And that kind of escalation had no ceiling." "Admiral," the tactical officer said, turning toward Vorn with something close to urgency, "we need to make a decision. If this continues—" "I know what happens if it continues," Vorn said. He did. He could see it now, not through data, but through instinct sharpened by years of command. The boundary would hold, for a time. Humanity would adapt, faster. The entities would respond, differently. And somewhere in that cycle, something would break. Not the boundary. Not the fleet. Something deeper. Something that could not be repaired once lost. He turned back to Ortiz. "You said this wasn't built to stop them," he said. "Only to delay." "Yes." "For what?" She didn't hesitate. "For us to decide," she said. The weight of that answer settled over him. Because the decision wasn't theirs alone. It never had been. Behind the fleet, the presence at the boundary shifted again. Not probing. Not testing. Watching. Waiting. As if aware that something critical was about to happen. Vorn looked at the display one last time. The expanding network, the distortions pressing against it, The planet below that had chosen to stand in the center of something far older and far more dangerous than any empire. "They're not afraid," one of the officers said quietly. "No," Vorn replied. He understood now. "They've done this before." The room went still. Does that mean they knew how it ended? He turned back to the command deck, his voice cutting cleanly through the tension. "Prepare full withdrawal." Shock rippled through the officers. "Admiral," the tactical officer began. "That is an order," Vorn said. "But if we retreat?" "They escalate somewhere else," Sin finished. Vorn nodded once. "Yes," he said. The truth was simple. They could not stop what was happening. But they could choose where they stood when it did. Behind them, the distortions pulsed again, closer now, more defined, as if the moment of decision had drawn their attention. As if they were waiting to see what humanity would choose, and whether anyone else would be there to witness it. The withdrawal began in silence. No declarations. No final threats. No attempt to reclaim dominance in the face of something that had already rendered it meaningless. The Karthik Union fleet disengaged with the same precision it had arrived with, but this time, there was no confidence behind the movement. Only clarity. Admiral Kale Vorn stood at the forward display as the first ships broke formation, engines aligning for exit vectors beyond the expanding boundary. The lattice did not react to their departure. It did not tighten, did not track, did not acknowledge them at all. Because it never had. They had mistaken themselves for participants in a war. They were witnesses to something else entirely. "Exit trajectories holding," the navigation officer reported. No resistance. Of course there wasn't. They were not the ones being held. Behind them, the boundary pulsed again, brighter this time, not weakening but shifting. The distortions pressing against it had grown more defined, more present, as if the act of decision had drawn them closer. Not aggressively. Curiously. Vorn watched one of them, if it could even be called that, slide along the edge of the lattice, tracing its structure with a precision that suggested memory rather than discovery. "They've seen this before," he said quietly. "Yes," Sin replied. "And they came back anyway." That was the part that mattered. Because whatever humanity had faced in the past, it hadn't ended. It had paused. The channel opened one final time. Dr. Lena Ortiz appeared, and for the first time since their arrival, there was no distance left in her expression. No controlled calm. No measured restraint. Just exhaustion. And something else beneath it. Resolve. "You made the right call," she said. Vorn didn't respond immediately. He studied her, searching for something, confirmation, perhaps, or contradiction. He found neither. "This doesn't end with us leaving," he said. "No," she replied. "Then why let us go?" A small pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. "Because you understand now," she said. That answer carried more weight than any explanation. Behind Vorn, the fleet continued its withdrawal, ship after ship slipping beyond the outer edge of the system. The distortions did not follow. They did not pursue. They remained focused on Earth. On humanity. What happens next? Honest. Ortiz looked past him, her gaze distant, fixed on something he could not see. "We hold," she said. "For how long?" This time, she didn't answer right away. And when she did, it wasn't with certainty. "As long as it takes," she said. The channel closed. No farewell. No final statement. Just silence. Vorn stood there for a moment longer, watching the boundary pulse against the growing pressure, watching the distortions shift and align and learn, watching the planet at the center of it all remain exactly where it had always been. Contained. Not because it had to be. Because it chose to be. "Admiral," Sin said quietly, "the archive, it's updating again." Vorn didn't turn. "Read it." Sen's voice carried something new now, not fear, not uncertainty, but the weight of understanding. "Status, containment active," he read. "Subject species maintaining boundary integrity. External entities remain engaged." The pause. Assessment, ongoing. That was it. No resolution. No victory. No conclusion. Just ongoing. Vorn exhaled slowly, the realization settling deeper than any report or data stream could capture. This wasn't a war humanity had won. It wasn't even a war they were fighting. It was a responsibility. One they had accepted long before the Karthic Union had ever reached their system. One they had never abandoned. The fleet crossed the outer threshold of the boundary. And for a brief moment, something noticed them. Not the way it had noticed Earth. Not with focus. But with awareness. Like something acknowledging movement at the edge of its attention. Then it turned back. Because they didn't matter. Not here. Not anymore. Vorn watched the system shrink behind them, the lattice fading into distance, the distortion still pressing, still learning, still waiting. And for the first time in his life, he understood what true power looked like. Not conquest. Not domination. Not the ability to destroy. But the ability to stand at the edge of something unknowable. And hold the line anyway. He turned from the display. Set course for Union space, he said. No one spoke. No one questioned. Because every officer on that deck had seen it, had felt it, and knew, without needing to say it aloud, that somewhere behind them, on a small blue planet that had never left its system, humanity was still fighting a war no one else even knew existed. And they were winning. For now.